Welcome back to Philosophy 1101, Problems of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. Today will be our third discussion and final discussion of issues in ethics. This time we'll be discussing the ethical doctrine known as deontology, or deontological ethical theories. Deontological ethics are one flavor, one species of the idea of thinking about ethics that is known as moral objectivism. This is the doctrine that there is a fact of the matter as to what's right and wrong, and that this fact is not, so to speak, relative to any point of view. Moral objectivism is compatible with quotidian relativism, that is the idea that we can recognize lots of difference of opinion in the world as to right and wrong. You can hold this objectivism without, so to speak, sitting in judgment of others. That is to say, without thinking of yourself as being superior to other people, because one can judge somebody else to have made a moral error without thinking that you're yourself immune to such errors. And you can also respect other people's autonomy while being an objectivist, because as we noted last time, we saw that even if I do think another person or another society is doing something immoral, it's a further or more complicated question whether I should actually intervene and try to change them, and often doing so will do more harm than good. And so, as it were, being hegemonic in my ethical thinking does not follow from being an objectivist in that ethical thinking. And notice that also that utilitarianism is an objectivist moral theory. Now, by way of thinking about where today's discussion, today's kind of moral theory stands, let's go back to the table that we considered before. We talked about answers to the question, what makes right acts right? And we considered, first of all, the consequentialist view, one form of which is ethical egoism, another which is utilitarianism. Today I want to focus on the idea that emphasizes motives, and that's associated with the philosopher Immanuel Kant. In this course, we won't have time to think about the natural law tradition or other traditions in ethical thinking, but today we'll move on to another of the two main topics in ethics that we'll be able to discuss in this course. The most famous proponent of deontological, nowadays known as Kantian ethics sometimes, is Immanuel Kant, whose dates were 1724 to 1804. He was one of the most influential philosophers of the Western tradition. He also had interests in natural science, in particular astronomy. He was the first recorded scholar to postulate other galaxies. And nowadays, what's sometimes called Kantian ethics has many current champions. That is, there are a good number of contemporary professional philosophers who make a career out of defending one another aspect of the Kantian position as an approach to ethical questions. On his tomb, where he is buried in Königsberg, Germany, he wrote, there's a quotation from something that he wrote, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The more often and perseveringly my thinking engages itself with them. The starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." Kant seems to be suggesting here that there's something sublimely powerful about at least two things that he's taken notice of: the starry heavens that we mentioned before in considering his work on astronomy, and the moral law within me. And when he talks about the moral law within him, we want to ask the question, what does that mean? What does that come to for Kant, and why should that be of interest to us? Immanuel Kant's influence has been very great. His so-called categorical imperative and its implications, which were formulated in 1785, informed some very important documents of the 20th century, including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, written after the end of World War II, the Political and Economic Covenants of 1966, and the International Criminal Court of 2002. And just to give you the flavor of this deontological way of thinking, you can see it in application to various issues that we've touched on thus far. For example, from the deontological point of view, punishment can be justified even when doing so does not maximize overall happiness. That is, we mentioned the deterrent as well as the retributivist theories of punishment, and the Kantian approach, the deontological approach, would certainly be a retributivist theory in the sense that punishment can be justified even if doing so does not maximize happiness, and yet we nevertheless think that it's justified from the deontological point of view because, for example, punishing the perpetrator involves treating him with respect, and maybe also the victim. In our example of Dr. Jones and Rufus, it would be clear from the Kantian point of view that Dr. Jones should not euthanize Rufus, even if doing so saves the lives of 10 child prodigies. In the example of the mayor of Chicago dealing with a terrorist who's planted bombs all around the city, the deontological view would say the mayor of Chicago must not torture the terrorist's daughter, no matter the number of lives that might be saved if she or he does. We might also ask from the Kantian point of view, are there ever any restrictions on the conditions under which, for example, suicide might be permissible? Ways of treating ourselves, not just others, fall under the rubric of deontological ethics. Now, this idea of the formula of the end in itself is something central to Kantian thinking, so here's the way he puts it. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. So let's talk for a moment about what it means to use people. Kant is here distinguishing between two ways of doing so. You could use somebody as a means, or you could use somebody as a mere means. To take the former example, I could use somebody as a means when, for example, I go to a bank and go up to a teller and I ask to make a withdrawal from my account. I'm using that teller as a means to getting my hands on some cash that I want to use, but there's nothing particularly ethically problematic about that. Nothing particularly ethically troubling about that kind of interaction. Whereas if I use somebody as a mere means, then in a way I'm not respecting them as an individual. In a way I'm using them just as a tool for my own purposes that does not provide any respect for their own autonomy, their own nature as a person. So for example, to take a different case, if you and I are walking along the street and I see a car coming by that looks like it's a place from which bullets are about to emerge, somebody's pulling out a gun and they're starting to fire. If I now knock you over and use you as a shield while hiding behind you, let you take the bullets rather than me, that I'm using you as a mere means, a sort of the hunk of matter, so to speak, that's in front of me that I'm using in order to protect myself from being killed. That is a relationship that Kant would say is problematic because there's no sense in which I'm respecting you as an autonomous individual. And also, Kant will say that there are ways in which you might treat yourself as a mere means. So famously, he had remarks about suicide, and Kant says that if you think about committing suicide, what you're probably doing is assuming that the right action is one that will allow you to put your own misery away. That is to say, get over your troubles, get over your misery because, for example, someone you loved broke up with you or something very bad has happened and has made you very depressed. If your choice is to commit suicide in order to solve the problem, then you're using your own self as a means to the end of seizing your pain, getting your pain to stop. And Kant would say that is ethically troubling as well. We might also wonder, and I hope our discussion will come back to the question later on in this course, whether or not there are ever any conditions under which it's morally acceptable to commit suicide, but Kant is clear that there's at least some types of acts of suicide that are morally troubling and that violate this idea of using people as a mere means. Kant, notice, has something to say in application to ourselves and our treatment of ourselves, not just to others. Now, we might also think about how this way of thinking applies to the case of people having a debate. Suppose two people are having a debate about a question, and perhaps it's being judged by an audience. The audience will decide with votes as to which side has the best case, who's done the best job in supporting their case on some controversial contemporary topic, for example. Most of us would go into a debate like this thinking that a debate should be won or lost on the merits of each speaker's arguments. And that's different from what sorts of the other kinds of ways in which somebody might, so to speak, win or try to win a debate. That is to say, we have a firm sense of what kinds of tactics would be dirty. For example, personal insults, ad hominem attacks that point out, for example, that the speaker is in a way hypocritical because even though she is, to take an example we've discussed before, even though she is arguing that smoking is dangerous and should be taxed more highly in order to pay for the health care costs that the country has to incur in order to respond to the diseases that smoking causes. If somebody were to point out that she's a smoker herself, that would be an ad hominem attack that would not be a proper response to the nature of the debate and the topic of the debate. By contrast, clean tactics require proper content of discussion as well as proper direction of that discussion. So you can think of, in the case of debaters, ways in which there is a sort of there's a contest here, but there's a way of fighting clean and a way of fighting dirty. And when we fight dirty, what we're doing is essentially misusing the enterprise, exploiting it for our purposes of winning in order to triumph, but at the same time not respecting the other interlocutors in the debate, because what we're doing is bypassing what should implicitly be understood as the appropriate rules for this kind of exchange, and doing so just in order to succeed, in order to prevail. And Kant again would say, here's a case of playing dirty, even if the result is that you win. In this course, we won't be reading any of Kant's own writings. They tend to be fairly dense, fairly difficult to get through. I hope that in a more advanced course you'll take the opportunity to do so. But one contemporary philosopher, I mentioned that there are a number of contemporary philosophers who try to defend one or another aspect of Kant's complex lines of thought, and one famous philosopher who's done so on the topic of warfare is Thomas Nagel, in a famous paper of his called War and Massacre, in which he tries to argue that there are certain ways of carrying out warfare that are ethical and others that are not. And while many of us feel sensitive to the difference between those countries, for example, that engage in a just kind of war and just kind of way of carrying out warfare as opposed to others that are not, it's easy to get confused when there's so much at stake in the context of war. So Nagel writes, certain restrictions on warfare are neither arbitrary nor merely conventional, and their validity does not depend simply on their usefulness. That is to say, there are certain restrictions on the conduct of war that, for example, the United States and many other countries have signed on to, that are not just things that we chose to be polite, but rather connect in some way to deep aspects of ethical treatment and ethical behavior. And we sign on to these restrictions even if there are ways in which violating them might give us an edge in warfare. Nagel continues, when one of the choices in the context of war is to do terrible things to another person, the problem is altered fundamentally as to what we ought to do. It's no longer a question of which outcome would be worse. That is to say, when we're deciding how to carry out a line of attack or a line of self-defense, generally speaking, there's a very good chance that we're going to end up killing one or more people. No matter what, something terrible is likely to happen. But the issue, Nagel points out, does not immediately become which is the lesser evil in the sense of the utilitarian way of thinking about which is going to cause the smallest amount of suffering, because some ways of causing minimal suffering might also be ways that result in treating people unethically. That's the complex and subtle aspect of Nagel's point of view that we need to investigate. So Nagel discusses what people talk about as the problem of means and ends. In his paper, he raises the question, points out that many people during the Vietnam War, when he was writing his paper, raised questions such as, is it justified in the sense that does the end that we're trying to achieve in this war justify the means that we're taking to do so? Now, that would be a natural question from a utilitarian point of view. But from an absolutist, as Nagel uses the term, or Kantian or deontological point of view, that question does not always apply in a very natural way. That is, utilitarian perspectives can offer some limits on what's allowable in war, in the sense that some methods, some means of attack, some means of self-defense, some strategies are not utilitarian in the sense that they tend not to produce the greatest overall amount of good. However, the utilitarian will hold that the end always justifies the means if the payoff is high enough. So if the payoff is high enough, then the utilitarian position is going to say it's perfectly appropriate to use children, non-combatants, etc., as human shields in order to protect strategically important points in your defense system. And if you think that torturing someone is likely to produce some information that you need for strategic purposes, then the utilitarian will say, go ahead and torture that person. Do no more harm than you need to, but still torturing that person will be justified on utilitarian grounds, or at least could very well be justified on utilitarian grounds. So notice that, as we saw with Mill in our discussion last time, every so-called principle, rule of justice, human right, etc., from the utilitarian perspective, every such principle has its price. There's always going to be, at least in principle, the possibility of a situation that will arise in which the costs of, for example, torturing someone are minimal. They will produce some unhappiness, all right, but they'll be vastly outweighed by the amount of happiness that we might achieve if we can get the information from this person that we need. And so you're using this individual, this captured soldier, for example, as a way of producing more utility, as a way of sort of churning out more utility for the greater overall amount of well-being. But notice that in so doing, you're not paying a particular amount of respect to this individual as a person, as an autonomous agent. And that's the kind of thing that the absolutist or Kantian is going to object to. So the absolutist has no problem per se with maximizing good consequences. The absolutist is happy with the idea of producing more utility overall. Nor does she advocate pacifism across the board. Being an absolutist does not mean that you are going to say that warfare, killing someone, is always morally wrong. By no means do they say that. But according to the absolutist, there are some conditions in which consequence maximization does not justify an action, for instance, torture, intentional bombing of civilians, or using non-combatants as targets, even if doing so will produce a greater overall amount of utility than other options that are before you. So if, for example, using chemical weapons is something that you're quite confident is going to give you a very significant tactical advantage in this particular war that you're engaged in, then the utilitarian might very well say, yes, go ahead and use chemical weapons, whereas the absolutist is likely to say, no, that's morally unacceptable, therefore it cannot be done, even if the utilitarian calculation tells you to do so. So the absolutist position is going to say there are limits on what's allowable in warfare. So even in adversarial situations, the absolutist will say, we need to treat one another as persons rather than as tools or as props. Those are the ideas that Nagel uses as sort of stand-ins for the idea of treating people as mere means. So again, while it's true that you could torture a person to get information out of him, you're using him as a tool for the production of information, as opposed to treating him as another person. Being a person, that is, implies that there are certain ways in which you cannot be treated by another government, by another army, etc., where the cannot here is an ethical norm. It's a moral injunction, which, in order to be a moral person, one would need to follow. And this cannot be overruled by considerations of expedience. That is to say, there are no sufficient numbers of lives saved, even, that where you could get a high enough number such that then it becomes justified, morally acceptable to torture someone. The Kantian is going to say that is not the right way of thinking, because doing so will require eventually treating someone as a mere means. If we do that, then we have broken out of the ethical sphere and have just started treating each other as tools to our ends as opposed to fellow individuals. I mentioned before the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. Here's a preamble which has what you might think of as, a preamble to that document, which has what you might think of as Kantian language. We read, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, whereas disregard and contempt for human rights has resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind, and the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people, whereas it's essential, if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. So the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights is trying to put down international laws that will protect these things called rights that are considered to be inalienable, and the idea of inalienable rights goes hand in hand with the idea of a Kantian perspective or absolutist perspective on which these rights are absolute. They're not to be outweighed by considerations of utility. So notice then that major international political doctrines and documents and ways of trying to carry out behavior on the part of nation states have been influenced by, among others, Kantian ways of thinking. And I should also suggest that our everyday intuitive thinking about right and wrong is going to be influenced by these things as well. So if you're trained in American schools, if you were raised in many of the American school systems, whether it be private or public, you were, like myself, brought up hearing the stories of the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we're told that the choice to drop these bombs was motivated on utilitarian grounds because, for example, a land invasion of the relevant islands of Japan would probably have been extremely costly to lives on both sides of the battle. But this meant deliberately sacrificing the lives of non-combatants, that is dropping the bombs, meant deliberately sacrificing the lives of non-combatants in order to avoid a high casualty land invasion. And as a result, it's a choice that the absolutists would probably challenge. That is to say, the dropping of the atomic bombs in order to achieve the end of World War II, even if doing so produced greater overall amount of utility than a land invasion would have done. The Kantian is likely to say, even if doing so would have produced more utility, nevertheless, the dropping of the bombs would have been morally unacceptable. Here's an example of an atomic bomb going off above Nagasaki from an aerial perspective. Here's a life down on the ground kind of picture of a baby who's been affected and her mother. Probably not much chance the baby will live very long. Somebody whose skin has been affected by the blast. Lots of horrific images that are easy to find of people who are victims. And the Kantian would want to say, it's not just numbers here. We shouldn't just think about warfare in a statistician's way. We need to think about individuals, persons, lives, the sort of pain and suffering that can be caused. And furthermore, the question whether or not the individuals involved are themselves innocent, whether they intended to try to attack others, or whether they were just trying to go about their daily business. That is not to say that it's impossible when you're fighting a war from the Kantian perspective. That's not to say that it can never be acceptable to do something that might cause accidental damage to non-combatants. But it's plausible that the dropping of the bombs was something that caused damage that we knew would very likely kill and maim a great deal of non-combatants. And so that's where the ethical question is raised. So the idea that the absolutists might have challenged the choice to drop the atomic bombs on Japan is something that might come as shocking to many Americans who are sensitive to the idea of ethically acceptable warfare. But the Kantian would nevertheless want you to think twice about whether that part of our culture, so to speak, is one that we should continue to adopt or whether we should think about it in a different way. So Nagel would go on and say, just as in the case of the debaters, we can talk about the case of warfare, and distinguish between fighting clean and fighting dirty. Now, I've got a right to defend myself if attacked. That is out of self-respect. If someone is attacking me, then self-respect enjoins me to do what I can to preserve myself against this incursion. I may only, however, direct my hostility towards the nature of the attack. That is, if someone is attacking me, attacking my views, I should attack or respond to them on the nature of the content of their attack as opposed to them in an ad hominem way, like we saw in the case of the debaters. Likewise, if someone is trying to attack me in a military way, trying to kill me, then there are certain ways in which my response is appropriate, other ways in which that would be inappropriate. And I may also direct my hostility towards an appropriate kind of hostility, that is, an appropriate kind of attack. We'll come back and discuss those in just a moment. If I meet these conditions, then I'm morally entitled to attack you while still showing you respect. That is to say, I can meet these conditions on ethically acceptable combat while still treating you as another person, without having to treat you, that is, as a mere means to an end. So Nagel will suggest that, first of all, if we assume that it's persons we're attacking and perhaps also trying to kill, we need to think about the distinction between the manner of our attack, that is the way in which we're attacking them, for example, the types of weapons we use, and who may be attacked. And these cannot be overridden by considerations of utility. In the case of the manner of attack, the idea that Nagel would suggest is that if someone's trying to kill you, then it's acceptable to respond to them by sending a bomb in their direction or shooting bullets in their direction, but causing them to suffer unduly with, for example, a flamethrower or chemical weapons is something that Nagel would say is morally dubious because it causes an undue amount of suffering. So too, there are going to be limits on who may be attacked. Even if cutting off supply lines or even if attacking Red Cross workers demoralizes the enemy, that would still be morally unacceptable, Nagel would say, because he would suggest that doing so is attacking people who are not themselves trying to kill you. Rather, they're just trying to support the lives of fellow human beings. Likewise, restrictions against chemical and biological weapons are justified on these grounds because, first of all, they often kill, maim people who are innocent non-combatants, firstly, and secondly, even if they do affect other soldiers, they do so in a way that's horrifically tortuous, causes them to suffer unnecessarily in the course of trying to fight for our lives. So Nagel would say there are restrictions on who you may attack and the means by which you do so. And those come from the fact that as combatants we need to respect one another as persons, not just treat each other as objects, as means to ends. Now, recent technology has in a way made the possibility of carrying out warfare in a slightly more ethical way. So within the last 15 years we've had the development of the sonic cannon, also known as a long-range acoustic device. This sends a very powerful sonic blast towards the enemy and makes it so that they cannot, without extreme discomfort to themselves, get closer to you than, say, 100 yards. This is very effective because it keeps combatants away, but it also is going to keep from killing them. It sort of immobilizes them. It's almost like a shield that they can't get through, but in the process can't do you a great deal of harm. Now, that's not going to prevent all kinds of attack. If they've got missiles and so forth, this might not solve the problem. But for those that are not that well equipped, the long-range acoustic devices can be very effective. It emits sounds, these sonic blasts that are over 150 decibels, and it does so at very long range. The descriptions that I've read suggest that the thing that you experience when you're within range of one of these things is an overwhelming desire to just get away. Drop everything and get away as fast as you can. If you stay within their close range for too long, as I understand it, your internal organs begin to rupture. It's a thing you want to get away from. But this is good because it allows us to neutralize the attacker without having to do any more damage to them than is necessary. By comparison, even bullets and bombs are fairly brutal. This allows us to neutralize an opponent without having to do any more damage than is necessary, than to just keep them from attacking anymore. About 3,000 of these acoustic devices were used over the past decade in Iraq, and nowadays, as I understand it, the New York and Boston police departments have purchased units. I'm not sure how much they've been used, but they're ready to be used in order to, for example, disperse riots. And again, these might be an ethically advantaged over firing rubber bullets or exploding bullets into crowds that are rioting, just because it saves lives while also neutralizing the threat. And I think Nagel would say, and other absolutists who discussed warfare would say, that this way of thinking about warfare puts some limits on what's morally permissible. And in the absence of such restrictions, it will always seem possible to find conditions that trump, that is, overrule treating others as persons. It's always going to be possible to find some justification for thinking that, well, at least one little bit of chemical warfare or a little bit of torture might be okay. But from the Kantian perspective, that would be a moral wrong turn. And I think many of us see that, or at least feel that, other governments, for example, or maybe even the United States government in certain cases, engage in warfare that is morally questionable. Now, is that just arbitrary or is it justified? I think the Kantian is going to want to say here, we can find justifications for our distinctions between those ways of carrying out combat that are morally acceptable and those ways that are not. And this Kantian perspective tries to give us an articulate way of explaining where we're coming from in that line of thinking. Now, this notion of treating someone as a means as opposed to treating someone as a mere means has been the topic of a great deal of controversy, textual elucidations and things of the kind among philosophers and others over the past couple of centuries. And I want to spend a little bit more time explaining one way in which the idea might be elucidated. So, as we saw before, when I use someone as a means, I take from them something that I need or want. The case of the bank teller being one. I take money from them if it comes from my account, and that's not intrinsically wrong. When I use somebody as a mere means, however, I treat them in a way that does not show them a minimal degree of respect. I'm not disrespecting the bank teller by going up to him or her and asking to make a withdrawal. But there are ways in which I disrespect others by treating them in a certain way. Let's see if we can elucidate that a little bit further. A contemporary elucidator of Kant, proponent of some of Kant's ideas, Honora O'Neill, is head of Newnham College in Cambridge, president of the British Academy, and author of influential works on bioethics, justice, Kant, and famine. And Professor O'Neill offers an elucidation of Kant's formula. She suggests that I use someone as a mere means, that is, fail minimally to respect them when I use them in a way to which they cannot in principle consent. The idea of consent is a centerpiece of O'Neill's way of thinking about the Kantian formula. And let's think about how that applies. In the case of Rufus, for example, could he have consented to being euthanized in order to save the lives of 10 prodigy children? I suspect we think probably not. Likewise, the terrorist's daughter. Could she have consented to being tortured within inches of her life in order to defuse the bombs that her father had set around the city of Chicago? Probably not. Likewise, if I choose to kill civilians in order to demoralize the enemy when I'm engaged in warfare, again it seems that the civilians would not have consented to being treated that way. Or if I profit from an addict, if I'm a drug dealer and I've got an addict that I'm making a lot of money off of, because I know that he really, really needs his fix, then I'm doing something to which he can't consent, at least if he knew beforehand, before he would become an addict, how I was going to treat him, he would not have signed on. And likewise, if I use a lover for sexual gratification, then that's a person that probably would not consent to being treated in that way. These are all cases in which presumably the person that's the target of my behavior or our behavior would not consent to being treated this way if they knew the facts of the situation. If they were informed on what's happening, what the other's plan and so forth, they probably would not sign the form, so to speak, saying, yes, that's fine with me. So the idea of consent here is something that connects up with the idea that when we act, we often act, at least implicitly, on a principle of some sort. Kant writes that whenever we act, he makes a very strong claim here, we act on at least one principle or maxim. And the maxim that we act on, he wants to suggest, is one that needs to be, as it were, tested against, run through the filter of a kind of minimal condition. He writes, an act is right only if it's motivated by a principle or maxim that treats no one as a mere means. That is, this is a second major part of the Kantian ethical enterprise. That is, we should not treat people as mere means, even if we can treat people as means, but not as mere means. And more importantly, that gets put into action by saying that when we act, we have a principle that guides our action, and we need to make sure that that principle that guides our action is not one that includes within it the idea that we'll treat people as a mere means when it suits us. So for instance, if I lie to someone, I'm probably treating them as a means to getting something that I want, and in so doing I'm acting on a principle such as, for example, if I think I can get away with it, lie to someone in order to cut a corner, if doing so will give me an advantage. And that's a principle that treats the person to whom I've lied as a mere means, because presumably they would not consent to being lied to. If they knew what was going on, they would not accept the lie. Likewise, to consent to being treated in a certain way requires consenting to be on the, so to speak, business end of the maxim of that action. That is, think of it this way, if I can imagine my maxim, the maxim on which I act, being one that requires the interlocutor's or the object's consent, I could imagine myself, if I were in their shoes, how would I feel if I knew what was going on? Notice, therefore, that the imperative here that Kant is suggesting is a little bit connected, bears some similarities with the golden rule, what you were raised hearing about probably in one form or another, that is, treat others as you'd like to be treated. There's a connection here with that is because the Kantian perspective says, my position in the world is in a way nothing special. Just the fact that I'm here rather than somewhere else is something that I should, as it were, abstract from and think of myself as nothing particularly special or distinctive, but rather as one of many more or less rational individuals. And the question that raises is, if I treat you in a certain way, is that a situation in which I can imagine the connections, the relationship being reversed, so that I was being treated in that way? Is that something that I could accept, particularly if I knew the facts of the situation? If so, then Kant will say, my maxim has at least passed a minimal condition for what's required to be ethically acceptable. So, a primary example, a central example that Kant wants is the case of deception, and there are all kinds of ways of deceiving others that don't require telling them an explicit lie, but it's still the case that doing so would violate this idea that a person should be able to consent to being treated in a certain way. Likewise, think about the phenomenon of coercion. When I coerce others, they might be pushed in a certain way to behave in the way that I want them to, but if they knew that what I was trying to do was to coerce them, they might still say, that's not a way of behaving that I can accept, that I can buy into. But Honora O'Neill, developing the Kantian perspective, is going to say, the necessary connection with consent is one aspect, but it's kind of like a necessary condition for ethically acceptable behavior. We need to move on to another condition that she thinks is important in our treatment of others as well. So O'Neill will suggest that the litmus test, so to speak, of making sure that my action towards you is one to which you would be able in principle to consent if you knew the facts of the situation, is going to be a necessary condition, but not yet a sufficient condition for behaving as a decent human being from her point of view. She'll distinguish between the duty that we have towards treating people with a minimal degree of respect and what she'll call, following Kant, the idea of beneficence. So it's true that Kant suggests that we should see our interests as neither more nor less important than the interests of others, but that also brings with it not just a minimal condition on treating others with a minimal amount of respect, but also at least willing to go some way towards helping out your fellow human being. Think about our resonance towards the importance of everyday politeness. Suppose, for example, you're in an airport and there are some doors that open and close, and there's someone coming through who's very burdened down with suitcases, luggage of various kinds. No one else is around, and you might just feel inclined to hold the door open for them to help them get through. It's not going to save their or anybody else's life. There's no huge amount of ethical material here at stake, but it's still a decent thing to do. And you might also notice that if you were to do that and they said thank you, you might think to yourself or even say, you would do the same for me, or at least I hope you would do so. Notice, therefore, that there's a kind of symmetry in our thinking about one another when we engage in everyday politeness. The sort of you would do the same for me is a way in which we express the idea that my interests are in no particular way more important or more central than are yours. We're all beings that have aims and desires, and if it's not too much of a burden on me, maybe I could do a little bit to help you out. That's just everyday politeness and something that we engage in on a regular basis. And notice also that you will come to your decisions about one another, the ethical nature, status, as it were, of your potential friends and others are things that you come to develop a view about by seeing how they behave in, for example, situations like that. Do they show everyday common decency and politeness to others? That, you might want to say, is a kind of signal as to what kind of person they are deep down. This same spirit that connects up with the idea of everyday politeness and common decency, this same spirit, however, might have a little bit more of a hold on us if you think about its implications. It might suggest that you hold off on, for example, the latest iPhone upgrade or expensive dinner or new handbag when you know that others are suffering and you can feasibly do something about it. That is to say, O'Neill will suggest that the Kantian perspective should also make us think about other people who are less fortunate than ourselves. So being just, what you'll call justice, or the duty of justice, requires not using others as a mere means, whereas beneficent acts aim to help achieve what others want, especially, or at least including, when those wants that others have are nothing particularly ambitious or out of the ordinary, but just wants such as having a reliable source of square meals or a place to sleep that's safe and relatively clean. An everyday term for, as we mentioned before, small-scale beneficence is common decency, and we expect it of one another on a fairly regular basis. But O'Neill will point out that, especially with technology developing in such a way that it's possible to transfer money and goods more and more efficiently to people that are far removed from yourself, if you think about how vast the extent of world hunger is today, and you think about the relative difference there is between your likely level of wealth, both material and otherwise, and those of other people, it might make you think about how beneficence could apply to this case as well. So there are over 1 billion people across the world who are considered hungry by, for example, the World Health Organization. Every day, about 16,000 children will die from hunger-related causes. That's one child every 5 seconds. So in essence, hunger is an extreme form of poverty, when individuals or families cannot afford to meet most of their basic needs. And notice hunger can be, when it's chronic, can keep a person from developing physically, emotionally, cognitively, etc. And likewise, hunger is different in some countries from the way it is in ours. For example, the United States. There's hunger in the United States, but we also have institutions and resources, infrastructure that helps people who are suffering from hunger fight that in the context of food stamps and food banks. I'm not minimizing the amount of hunger that occurs in the United States. Right now, at the time of the making of this video, about 1 in 6 families in the United States are, so to speak, food insecure. That is to say, are not exactly sure where the next meal is coming from, and the meals that they do have are often inadequate. But in many other countries in the world, hunger is much more severe because, in part, there's no infrastructure even for helping to fight that hunger. Now, if we think about the way in which your resources, a small amount of money, for example, might enable you to help minimize that, then the Kantian perspective might say, well, actually, maybe I should feel a moral obligation to do something to help other people less fortunate than myself. It's easy for us to get hung up on, obsessed with the latest smartphone upgrade or bit of other material culture that we are interested in having. We'd like to adorn ourselves with those things. They are very nice. But if you compare the good that you'd get from one of these new devices with the importance of helping buy some malaria vaccine or provide some basic nutrition to children in other parts of the world, the Kantian perspective might say perhaps you should feel a duty of beneficence towards people less fortunate than yourself. And so long as you can feel reasonably confident that the thing that you want to provide, charitable contribution, for example, is likely to actually get to its intended destination, then you might feel this Kantian perspective gives you some reason for behaving accordingly. That is, giving up something that you value, because when you realize how small that is in comparison to the value that somebody else would get out of that same amount of cash, for example, then you might begin to think differently about how important it is for you. Notice also the utilitarian might justify providing you some of your excess wealth, some of your disposable income, for example, to people less fortunate than yourself. So notice that these ethical theories, both the utilitarian and the deontological, in spite of being fairly abstract, in spite of being fairly abstruse and general, nevertheless, if we find that we want to sign on to one or the other of them, and they both have big, significant, sometimes troubling consequences, are also going to have implications for everyday interpersonal affairs, including how we choose to spend our money, how we treat other people, decisions that we might someday make about, for example, whether to end our lives. These are ethical theories that are abstract and are discussed in a philosophical context, though, right, in classrooms and seminars and lectures and that kind of thing, but they also have real-world implications. And if you think about the implications that these theories have for contemporary issues like, for example, euthanasia, warfare, suicide, and others, we're going to see that these theories are ones about which we need to lose sleep to figure out where we stand with regard to our own ethical principles. So what I want you to do is think about how you respond to these ethical theories, the utilitarian as well as the deontological, and ask yourself where you stand relative to these two. Do you accept one more than the other? Do you want to get a sort of hybrid in some way? Do you want to choose a third kind of ethical theory that isn't represented by the things that we've discussed so far? And I suggest that you'll find that no matter where you land, so to speak, there might be some difficult implications, some consequences that flow from those commitments. And then the question is, will that cause you to revise the commitments in the first place, or cause you to say those implications are ones I just have to accept, whether that acceptance comes in the form of a new way of thinking about the limitations on warfare, or what you're going to do with the extra $20 you've got in your wallet.